A warm welcome to our afternoon sessions and this particular panel that is on eco-villages and environmentally conscious living. My name is Devin Zuber and I'm an Associate Professor of American Studies, Religion, and Literature here at the GTU. And it's a great delight to preside over this session. It struck me, looking at the beautiful, longer brochure that was developed for this conference, how there's a deep dialogue between the interreligious and the sustainable in the two quotes that serve as epigraphs, that also indirectly allude to the subject of today, eco-villages. There's a beautiful, pithy line from Gandhi about how the earth provides enough to satisfy everyone's need, but not everyone's greed. And then from Henry David Thoreau, from Walden, we need the tonic of wildness. At the same time that we are earnest to explore and learn all things, we require that all things be mysterious and unexplorable, that land and sea be indefinitely wild, unsurveyed and unfathomed by us because unfathomable. We can never have enough of nature. My own background is in environmental history and eco-criticism, and I spent a lot of time in the 19th century, and Thoreau was one of my subjects of interest. I have students in this class who are subjected to 4 weeks of reading Walden, page by page. And he's an interesting locus for this dialogue. Gandhi, of course, was a deep reader of Thoreau, and there's a way that civil disobedience is part of what happened with Satyagraha. Thoreau looms large in the American environmental imagination. He's a figure who first coins the modern use of ecology in English in America. And that text, about his 2 years spent at Walden Pond between 1843 and 1844, that he then turns into the book from 1854, has long been a part of an environmental sensibility into the modern moment. And it's not only in a deep debate about how one balances economic needs with sustainable living. If you've read Walden, you know the opening chapter is entitled Economy, and it's a salvo with Adam Smith, free market economics. It's also been a blueprint for a lot of alternative attempts to deviate from the norm of our capitalist social sorts of structures and institutions. Most recently, it's been claimed as a prototype for the tiny house movement that Thoreau at Walden building his cabin is sort of the genesis of that. So today, in the spirit of Thoreau, who also we should remember is a key moment of interreligious dialogue. During his Walden years, he is translating from French into English the Buddhist Lotus Sutras, which marks the advent of Buddhism into America. In the spirit of that interreligious and utopian dimension in the 19th century, our different papers today envision alternatives to the status quo. Different ways of living and being and thinking in relationship to others outside of Western traditions that provide alternative spaces to our modern extractive capitalism. And I think one thing the environmental crisis calls for is not just being more green through our consumptive patterns, whether we recycle, whether we're getting organic or not, but radically different modes of being with one another and the other than human. There was a talk recently given by Donna Haraway, based on her recent book, about living into our moment of climate change and crisis. And she and others are saying we shouldn't just talk about anthropogenic climate change, it's the capitalist scene, that our market-based view of the world as an endless supply of resources for extraction is part of the problem of the tangle that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to follow the way it's been done thus far and very briefly mention who is on this panel, following the program order. Sarah will go first. Okay, so that's how it is in the program. And some of these people have already been introduced to you before, so I won't belabor that much. I encourage you to read their illustrious biographies in the program. Our first speaker, Sarah Pike from Cal State University at Chico, is a professor of religious studies and the director of the Chico Humanities Center. And her talk today is entitled Rewilding America, Spirit and Land in Primitive Skills Community. She will be followed by Dr. Munir Jiwa, director of her Center for Islamic Studies, who will be giving a presentation on aesthetic engagements, art and architecture in the Islamic tradition, which follows through in his opening plenary remarks. You get to hear more about gardens and sort of these transnational, transreligious spaces. Next, Dr. Sharma will be discussing narrative imagination transformation towards an engaged Hindu eco-aesthetic that I believe will also be touching on a particular eco-village in India, which some of us have been blessed with knowing more about through her work on this space. Next on the panel is Debashish Banerjee, who is the Haridas Chowdhury Professor of Indian Philosophy and Culture and the Doshi Professor of Asian Art at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is also the Executive Director of the Nalanda International, which is based in Los Angeles. And his talk is entitled Auroville, Land, Technology, and the Micropolitics of Integral Living. And last, but by no means least, our own Gordon Gilmore, who is a PhD candidate in our Department for Philosophical Theology, will be giving a paper on Trinitarianism in Shalom for Indigenous Dialogue. Please join me in welcoming our various speakers.
Devin. Just a little bit. That's great. Thank you so much.
You want your presentation? We have to triple tap it?
No, I just double. It's fussy.
The magic touch. Devin Zuber and Rita Sharma and GTU in general for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, even though I'm only a few hours up the road. I don't get down to GTU often enough. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background so you have a sense of where I'm coming from. My training is in North American religious history, and I've spent the past 25 years researching new religious and spiritual movements, as well as expressions of religion and spirituality outside of religious institutions. So I'm really interested in festivals, ecstatic dance communities, radical environmentalism, and today the primitive skills movement. What are the sort of spiritual expressions that are embedded in and characteristic of these movements? I've also done a lot of research on nature religions, so religions like contemporary paganism that take nature as a kind of sacred symbolic center. And I'm coming from sort of an environmental humanities perspective and an ethnographic perspective. So I'm not coming as a practitioner of primitive skills, but as more of an anthropological observer. And this is really a report from the field, some pretty new field work for me on these communities, and I'll just say a little bit about that. I just finished a book on radical environmentalism, really looking at why young people get involved in radical environmentalism and what the sort of spiritual motivations as well as other motivations are. And I was curious to find out what happens to these people when they leave activism, when they move on, when they get burned out, whatever it is. And I found out that a number of them end up in permaculture communities, organic farms, and other sort of more daily practice-based communities. And that's how I started researching the primitive skills community, which I'll describe to you in a minute. So I've been calling these people sometimes rewilders, sometimes primitive skills. I'll move back and forth between that language. These are folks that try to live lightly on the land. That's their language. They often adopt ancient spiritualities, sometimes paganism, pre-Christian religions of Europe. Sometimes they appropriate Native American traditions, which I'll mention a little bit at the end, some of the issues with that. They may seem to be at sort of the fringes of ecological thought and action, but I really want to argue here today that sometimes at the fringes we see some of the most important work being done. I mean, these are people who see themselves as kind of outliers, but they're really engaging with the most central issues that we're all facing in terms of environmental change, species extinction, these kinds of issues. So I'm interested in the ways that they have a kind of spiritual orientation to the world. And as I'm talking, it may not be as explicit as I would like it to be, but I'm going to try to, as I'm describing what they're doing, to bring out some of that. So again, the idea that the wild is inside of us as well as outside of us. And that part of what we need to do as human beings, in their perspective, is to rewild ourselves as well as the environment outside of ourselves. So they really conceive of themselves as embedded in and knotted up with other species, in interspecies relationships, as well as the material world, such as tools. I'm going to talk a little bit about tools today. So rewilders and primitive skills communities model relationships of interdependence with a material world full of vibrancy and agency, as well as complicated relationships, especially around eating with other species, both plants and animals. By stripping away layers of civilization and technology, rewilders starkly reveal our deep entanglement with the lives of others, both living and non-living. While they often fall short of their own ideals, and their life worlds are full of contradictions, which I'm going to suggest a bit at the end, nevertheless, I think their aspirations are suggestive for the rest of us. Many of the issues that emerge in the primitive skills movement mirror the larger struggles that we're undergoing to create sustainable communities. All right, let's try this and see what happens. Yes. So these are some of the themes. I don't know if I'm going to get to all of them, which just reminds me I better check and see what time I started so that I don't go over. These are some of the themes that I'm going to talk about. I want to just gesture towards some antecedents of European American ways of living on the land, and then remind ourselves that in the 1960s and 1970s there was a back to the land movement that really gives some of the context, historical context, for these contemporary back to the lands folks. Then I'll say a little bit about the primitive skills movement, some of what's going on in this movement, the kinds of villages, and they use the language of villages and tribes that they're trying to create. I want to look at how they spiritualize primitive skills and sustainable practices, so putting spiritual meaning into these practices. And then briefly talk about what it means for them to dwell in particular places, using Michel Foucault's notion of heterotopia from his essay of Other Spaces. I'll talk a little bit about tool use and sort of the agency and vibrancy of tools, drawing from Jane Bennett's work on vibrant matter. And then finally, rewilding the self and what it means to be intimate with the more than human world, the material world as well as the world of other life forms. All right. Anybody know what's on the slides? Yeah, Shaker community. So over here is Pleasant Hill, not far from where I grew up in Kentucky. On the left-hand side are the Amana colonies. So I just want to gesture towards the flourishing of sort of communal experiments in the 19th century, which I think for someone who does American religious history, this is an important historical context. Not going to say a lot about them, but just to point out that in many cases they were experimenting with gender roles. They tended to have a radical politics, sometimes socialist, sometimes anarchist. That's really important to remember, that it's not just 20th century, 21st century that's dealing with these issues. They also tried to spiritualize work in particular ways in farming, which is another aspect of the primitive skills movement. So there's a lot more that could be said about that. Then, of course, the counterculture movement of the 1960s and 1970s. This is the farm in Summertown, Tennessee, one of the most famous and long-living communal experiments. So that's sort of their initial, and of course they have their roots here in the Bay Area. And this is more contemporary. You can go there and visit and see what they're doing today. All right. So as I said, I just wanted to gesture towards that. So I want to talk about this sort of movement that grew out of the radical environmentalist world that I'm looking at, which is about undomestication, which sees civilization, industrialization as the problem, and advocates that we need to undomesticate ourselves, right? And it's very anti-civilization. I think this image kind of says it all. So often there's really an advocacy of the wild, however that is understood, retaking civilization, tearing down buildings, feral animals. And human beings have an ambiguous role in this world, which I'll say a little bit more about. This also is very much related to some people, some writers that have been promoting sort of wildlife corridors, the introduction of carnivores particularly, and lost wild food chains. These are more sort of biological issues. So there's a connection here, again, trying to undo domestication and uncivilize humans. That's the kind of language that they're using. And really the desire to reestablish a deep connection to other species, often through teaching primitive skills. So most rewilders hope to adapt ancient skills like metalworking, hide tanning, hunting, and gathering wild foods to contemporary life. They aim to live with the smallest environmental footprint possible. They treat the forest like a garden, so there's a lot of foraging in this movement. And they try to spread and learn skills that their distant ancestors practiced, at least that's the way they're thinking about it, before industrialization. So their models, it's a diverse movement, but their models vary from Paleolithic cave dwellers, so the kind of paleo theme here, and Native Americans to medieval blacksmiths and basket makers. So drawing from a number of different historical periods. There's a sense of loss and longing in these communities, and I think of it almost as a kind of paleo nostalgia in some cases. And even though they're really pretty practical about the impossibility of returning to this sort of primordial past, they seem to yearn for what they see as a pure lifestyle and trying to find ways to put it into practice in the contemporary world. The history of civilization, as they tell it, is one in which domestication and industrialization took a wrong turn, took us in a wrong direction. And it may be too late to reverse that. Many of them are fairly hopeless about the possibility of reversing it. But for them, they can at least opt out. So some of this is about opting out. And here's just an example from primitive skills teacher Peter Bauer. This is about rewilding death rituals. When I die, says Bauer, I would like my body buried in the ground, not burnt, not in a coffin, and without any gross fluids injected into it. I don't want to be in a cemetery. I don't want a headstone. I want a tree to be planted in my honor. If that's not possible, I would like a sky burial. I would like my body to be placed high atop a mountain and eaten by vultures. So even in these ultimate matters of life and death, rewilders want to reverse, return, redo, reject assumptions of what's they consider civilization, right? So this emphasis on undoing and taking apart civilization really permeates these communities as a wholehearted rejection of contemporary life. Many of them relish civilization's demise, even while harboring a deep love for the earth and its creatures. All right, so I spent some time going to a couple of primitive skills gatherings. This is a flyer for one on the left. This is Earth Skills River Cane Rendezvous, and it was in southeastern South Carolina, sort of near the Georgia border. There's a lot of these communities in the southeast, which I think is kind of interesting. Not that there aren't any out here, but these are some of the ones that I was learning about. All right, how am I doing? Okay. So just after the fall equinox in 2014, I went to my first rendezvous. And it was basically a gathering of people, like other kinds of festivals, and a sharing of skills. And there were workshops on the following kinds of things: learning to shoot with bows, carving wooden bowls with knives, weaving willow baskets, making buckskin moccasins. It included making kudzu bale houses. Okay, remember Southeast, kudzu, right? Not straw. Woven mats and slings, and there were also walks to identify trees and edible and medicinal plants, and to learn about animal tracks and mushrooms. So the people who attend the primitive skills gathering like this one come from really varied backgrounds. Some of them would consider themselves atheists. There were quite a lot who might consider themselves pagan with a small p, or spiritual but not religious with a small s, right? So I'm looking at a group of people who are largely outside of institutional religion, although there were some folks there who identified loosely as Christian, but they were not in the majority. Many of these gatherings are what I think of as adopting a kind of meta-pagan way of looking at the world. So they often follow the pagan wheel of the year, so they would celebrate the solstices, the equinoxes, and the festivals in between those. So they would hold their gatherings on these occasions. And in order to create a sense of community for these disparate groups, they're really trying to create rituals that can bring people together and not be too religiously specific, because they don't want to exclude anyone, so that's an important part. At this primitive skills gathering on the left, at the end there was a procession of earth spirits, was the name of the ritual. And people basically dressed up. There were a lot of kids there. They wore leaves and flowers in their hair. They were dressed as ogres and fairies, and they danced around the campfire. So the procession of earth spirits had a kind of spiritual component, but wasn't identified with any particular tradition so that anyone could participate in it. All right, this is just the example of a vision statement from the Kaluna permaculture community. So many of the people that attend these primitive skills gatherings are living in community. Not all of them are. Some come from cities, some are living alone. But there's a number of communities that are trying to be based on primitive skills. And this is just one of them, so you can read through a bit of their sort of their commitment. Some of the people in this community were at the primitive skills gathering. That's how I learned about this particular community. It's in North Georgia. And so they're using permaculture principles, but they also have celebrations around the pagan wheel of the year. They have a fertility festival. So they're trying to incorporate a kind of spiritualization of the cycle of the seasons in their community. And I'm going to kind of move on. So I went to another community. This is also in the southeast outside of Asheville, North Carolina. It's called Wild Roots. And this is a community that was started by burnt out radical activists. So that's how I knew about it. And they came and started this community here to teach. And I'm just going to give you, let's see if I have a quote from them. Yeah, here's a quote from them. We are at a unique juncture in history with an increased awareness in the possibility of our own extinction from not living responsibly and in harmony. Relearning to tend the land will take patient, imperfect steps. As elements converge that lead to collapse of systems, so converge streams of reawakened instincts and increased consciousness. Many of us long for the clans and tribes that we know in our bones. So I'm just going to take you through a bit of this. So I was there for a few days. And these are folks that are both sort of improvising ways of being more sustainable, but also drawing on the past. So, for instance, they weren't hunting like some of these other communities. They weren't hunting, but they would take meat the hunters would drop off, often bear meat. So they had a lot of bear fat that they were using for cooking because hunters they'd hunt the bears, but then they don't use them. And so they would process all the meat and use them themselves. They also would eat dumpstered food and food that the grocery stores had basically given away. So they were gleaning as well as trying to develop some or redevelop some ancestral ways of doing things. These bark houses are based on traditional Cherokee methods from the same area. They're made out of tulip poplar trees. And I'm really interested here in sort of the agency of place and kind of dwelling in place. And how and we're talking about mostly middle-class white Americans who are making these choices. What does it mean to go from, in this case, the two people who I met there have been living in the suburbs of California, to go to this? How does that change your sense of self and your relationship to the environment, to live in a space like this day in and day out throughout the seasons? So I'm really interested in that, the sort of dwelling in these kinds of spaces, in these kinds of communities. And then this notion of rewilding the self. So notice what people are wearing here. So even a sense in which your body, what you put on your body, expresses in some way your affinities to the rest of the world, to other creatures. On the left is acorn and possum stew. So there's a very strong emphasis in this community of using roadkill, of hunting and fishing for your own food, or taking donated food, as I said. So here's your acorn and possum stew. It's very local, but there's a sense of intimacy with the other than human beings in your local area, whether those are roadkill that you've taken off the road or a bear that someone's dropped off near you. All right, so the last sort of issue I want to talk about briefly is the ways in which tools themselves are spiritualized in these communities. The tools themselves carry a lot of symbolic value, and so I borrowed from Jane Bennett's idea of vibrant matter to think about vibrant tools, because these tools represent for people this desire to be part of ancestral lifeways, and that's their term for it. And to locate yourself in a longer history and a relationship to cultures of the past as you're looking towards a future that you want to bring into being. And so this is a scythe. So there's no power tools, right? So, you cut your wood with an axe, you strip you build your houses by hand. So there's a lot of connections with the maker movement, doing things by hand, doing them for yourself. Just going to give you some examples. These are photos I took at Wild Roots Community. They aren't the best photos like some of the others I have, which are taken by professional photographers. But look at the saws just hanging here. And then there's these lids of mason jars. I mean, there's just something beautiful about a kind of aesthetic of these tools so that they take on a presence in this world. And then you have an anvil over here that Todd, who is one of the people living in this community, used while I was there. And then finally on the left is a very common practice that primitive skills community folks are sharing, which is an Egyptian bow drill. So it's starting a fire without matches, right? And it's pretty amazing. It's almost impossible to do if you've never done it before. But if you're an expert like Todd, you can get it going pretty quickly. And I was there in October. It was quite chilly in the mornings up in the mountains of North Carolina. So it was really wonderful to have him starting a fire in the morning in this way. And this is a common practice that they teach, especially to young people who come through the community. But it's just a beautiful tool, and I think this sort of almost fetishization of tools and the meaning that the tools carry is really interesting. This is an example of getting the bark off the tree to make the houses that I'm talking about. All right, and then finally, or am I at the end? Yeah, that's fine. So I just want to, at the end of this, kind of raise some issues about what I've said. There's a lot of appropriation from Native American cultures as well as working with Native people. It's a very complicated and contested issue in these communities, which obviously there's a lot to say about this, and I didn't really touch on it. But the presence of teepees at primitive skills gatherings is a problematic issue that people have raised. So here, just to conclude, are some of the questions that came out of or issues that came out of my initial research that I'm going to be pursuing, and I would love to take up with any of you. The meanings of the wild and the primitive. What's the primitive in the primitive skills? How does romanticizing cultures of the past affect our notions of race and gender? How do we bring together these sort of apocalyptic expectations of the demise of civilization with utopian hopes for a better future? How do we deal with the sort of biocentric environmental activism component and the anthropocentric survivalism that also is at the fringes of these communities? How do we balance eco-justice and social justice concerns? We've heard a lot about that already today, so I think that is an issue that these communities are dealing with. And finally, as I already said, the affinities with and appropriations of indigenous worldviews, how to deal with those. So thanks very much.
We'll move on to our next speaker and table our questions for the end.
Something else. I don't know.
I'm going to plug into that.
Yeah. Probably when people listen, this mine will go away. What's that? Yeah, I know. I know. This is our I know we all have to talk I know I saw it. The pictures are good.
Welcome back, everyone. I met some of you this morning. I'm actually really looking forward to presenting some of this material to also hear how you're thinking about it. It's sort of new to me, but a different way in which I've been thinking about some of my work. So for those who I didn't have a chance to meet, I'm Munir Jiwa. I direct the Center for Islamic Studies here at the Graduate Theological Union, just starting our 10th year this summer, so I've been here 10 years. So And part of, and I'm also trained as an anthropologist, so I come back to some of this work and as my training as an anthropologist. A lot of my work in the past, besides all the administrative stuff now, has really been around aesthetics and the arts, and looking at how kind of the aesthetic dimensions of life provide us a different venue in which we think about our social interactions and kind of our networks of being. So we often think in kind of political terms, social terms, and economic ones, and cultural ones, but within the kind of cultural dimensions, there are also aesthetic concerns that I think that can bring many of these different areas together. So as I said earlier this morning, one of the ways in which I've been trying to think about what it means to be a steward or a khalifa or khalif in the Islamic tradition on the earth is a kind of moral mandate from the particular community that I'm from. Right? So from the Islamic tradition, yet those moral mandates allow us to find a focus, but they are universal as well. So how do we draw from the particularity of our traditions, whatever they might be, and how do those particularities translate into a kind of universal possibility of encounter? And that's not easily done because in the abstract it sounds pretty nice, but we're all limited by various social factors, by various identities, by the social structures which provide some different kinds of privileges to different people. So there are different advantages here, so I'm not unaware of those. But in the abstract, these things sound really nice. How can we all just get along? And then the more important questions of who gets to talk about getting along, and who gets to live in these intentional communities when there's others who struggle to be out of these communities. And so just thinking about that also in the context of privilege, and then taking our kind of local kind of lived realities and putting them in global terms. So these are huge things we always have to think about in our particularity as well. So part of what's moved me in the last few years that GTU has been doing more of this work in the area of sustainability is what I think began with earlier today on this idea of earthlings. How do we imagine ourselves if we imagine ourselves as earthlings? What difference does that make vis-a-vis other kinds of ways we identify through nationality, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, language, race, ethnicity? What does this kind of term or identity, earthlings, do for us? And Dr. Russell kind of alluded to some of it. I always get a little worried when there's too much talk around other life out there. I sort of like, it's overwhelming sometimes to think about, could there be other life forms that maybe look like ours, or I don't know what, I can't even imagine it, but it is daunting, and it's daunting for a variety of reasons. First, it allows us to, or it exerts a kind of imagination that we might not have thought about, but it also raises really huge ethical and moral questions for us as well. And for those of us who are either religiously committed or working in the area of religion, it poses a variety of questions for us in terms of kind of life out there. So I've been thinking about this term earthlings as a kind of universal category, or at least a planetary earthly category in the universe, and then the kind of particular identity of myself as a Muslim, and how do these fit together? What is my location? What is my particular location? Are there multiple locations? And how do those particular locations allow me to be in conversations with the other? What are the limits on that, and what are the ways in which we can draw on this? So a lot of this I see is also about relationships and relation building. So at least in the Islamic tradition, when I often think of what my relationship to God is, that relationship is my relationship to others as well, right? It's what often is termed the horizontal and vertical relationship, but in the Islamic tradition, they're both together. that our relationship to God is our duty to our to humanity, but that's also thought of largely, it's also to the animals, to the plants, to the environment. So when I began earlier, I mentioned, of course, the Quranic verse, chapter 49, verse 13 in the Quran, which says, "We've made you nations and tribes so that you may know one another." And this idea of knowing one another is a reciprocal one. So you know each other. It's reciprocal. So it requires us to come together in an encounter. And the second is this idea of a masjid, which is just the Arabic word for mosque. But in its etymology, masjid comes from the root sajda, which is just the word for meaning prostration, a place of prostration, and that's why Muslims will say, well, the whole world is a mosque, and they don't mean it's just a place of prayer, but in some ways it is. What is meant by that is that the whole place is sacred. The whole world is sacred. Everywhere, everything around you is sacred. And so if you take that as your frame or your approach to life, then your relationships not just to fellow humans, but to animals, to plants, and everything around you becomes a sacred relationship. And when you're kind of in that mindset, then you can think about this stewardship, which we call khalifa in the Islamic tradition, as your stewardship on earth, right? So if you think of everything and everyone as sacred, then it makes a demand on you, it makes an ethical and moral demand on you to act in that way. And this is, again, from my particular tradition, so I know that those who might not be believing in one God or have different traditions, just to think about this in your own traditions or no traditions, or if that can exist, or the nuns, or these different categories. So when I'm using God, I'm using it from my tradition, and so others can find maybe some resonance in your own tradition as well. So this idea of a moral mandate, I think is one that I can take from my tradition, but that moral mandate requires me to be in conversation, in relationship with the other. Now, what is the nature of that relationship? So I argued, so a lot of the ways in which we think about the environment more generally, or sustainability, can be in the kind of restricted sense, as we heard earlier from Dr. Wood and others, around issues of waste, wattage, energy, water, food. These are our lived environment, but they could also be thought of, as I would argue, through kind of an aesthetic sensibility about the world, right? And what I mean by that, and I'll show you a video in a minute, is really how to bring kind of beauty back into the world, so that, for example, the work of the Aga Khan Development Network, an agency of various organizations that have come together from doing work around education to healthcare, a lot of cultural projects. The ones that I've been most interested in are the parks that they work on and the museums. And what you find in a lot of this work is the way in which the political, social, cultural, economic, and aesthetic come together. So, and I'll give you a few examples of that, but take one example. The Aga Khan, who is the 49th leader of the Ismaili Muslim community, has made it his life's work and his community's life's work to kind of give back to the world in a universal way, but what they draw on and what they call an Islamic ethics, right? So it's universal, but they increasingly call it an Islamic ethics. So it's, again, translating the moral mandate that is particular in the idiom or the language of the Quran and the Islamic tradition, but translating it as a universal ethics. So again, the generosity of building these hospitals and schools and whatnot. And the approach they take is an integrated one. So for example, I worked a little bit at Al-Azhar Park in Cairo. So many of us have probably heard of Al-Azhar Mosque and University, also founded by the Fatimids, the same lineage that the Aga Khan comes out of. But there is a park that was kind of a dump site for hundreds of years, and nothing was really done to revitalize it. So, people could argue, well, why a park when there's so much other need, right? And why would you be worried about aesthetic concerns when there are so many other concerns? So right away, you often find that when people want to make an argument against aesthetics or the arts, it's usually because it's not so important on this kind of hierarchy of things that we have decided are more or less important. The Aga Khan Development Network and the Aga Khan's approach is that we need to think about this in an integrated way. So we can't just think about the parks as, most importantly it is, it's a beautiful and aesthetic space. It brings in communities together, but it also rejuvenates and revitalizes an entire community. It brings generations together. It makes people proud locally of their heritage and their culture and everything around them. So a lot of it is a kind of attention to local details. The other is the Forodani Park in Zanzibar, another beautiful space where in the old stone town, which is a lot of the Aga Khan and a lot of the Islamic cities, historic cities, are also UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and a lot of these are the places that the Aga Khan works in. Old Stone Town, for example, in Zanzibar, if you're in the Forodani Park, it's a place, again, of different communities coming together. There's generation, there's play, there's laughter, there's a possibility, there's greenery, there's flowers. So there's a possibility of people coming together in a space that they're not only proud of, but it allows for jobs. It creates a sense of people who don't have a place to go can come and sit in the park. So again, the way in which we think about assembly and public assembly and what parks allow for, I think is an important one. In the interest of time, I won't get to the museums, but I'll give you a sense of this through just bringing up the, is it already on, I think? So this is just a short video. It's a 30-minute video, so you could watch it on your own. I'll just show you a couple of minutes for you to get a sense of it. It's called Let the Beauty We Love Be What We Do, and it gives you a sense of the work of the Aga Khan Development Network. Again, they've done a lot of work in the areas of healthcare, education, universities, museums, and this is just an intro to that work. And then I'll close with a couple of questions you might want to consider.
The Islamic world probably has the highest concentration of historic cities of any world culture. And you're asking, can this concentration of assets become a trampoline for economic and social development? And the answer is very clearly yes.
No less than 1/3 of the UN's World Heritage Sites are in the Muslim world. By the 1970s, a yearning to be modern and a chronic lack of resources had combined to imperil Islam's inheritance. As he travelled the Muslim world, His Highness the Aga Khan became more and more concerned that this great cultural legacy was crumbling to dust. With formidable energy and determination, His Highness set out to reverse this trend. From its foundation, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture was designed to use cultural assets as catalysts for positive change. It wasn't mere restoration. It was about revitalizing communities, building their confidence, reinforcing identity, and restoring hope. Old skills are being relearned. Ancient villages and historic cities restored. New discoveries made. Economically depressed communities revived. Music and verse almost forgotten, now on stage again. Muslim heritage preserved for future generations. Stay with us as we travel from the deserts of West Africa to the foothills of the Himalayas to bring you a remarkable story of Muslim revival. Al-Azhar Park, Cairo, a green lung for one of the world's most densely populated cities. The park is more than just a place of rest and relaxation. Creating it from a rubble dump has spurred a commitment to restoring the treasures of Islamic Cairo in the core of the fabled Fatimid city while revitalizing a rundown neighborhood. The driving force behind this work is himself a descendant of the Fatimids, His Highness the Aga Khan. Renowned for their tolerance, the Fatimids reigned over an extraordinary flowering of the arts and sciences. Philosophers, physicians, mathematicians and architects flourished under the patronage.
So I'm sorry just to give you this glimpse, but I hope that'll get you to watch the full 30-minute video. I just want to leave with maybe a couple of considerations. One is just what I started off with earlier today about thinking about this as an approach to the Islamic tradition, the aesthetics, the parks, the art, the architecture, and the kind of way in which, as we've seen just with one snippet of a park, how it actually brings in different kinds of communities, right? So that the aesthetic should not be thought of just simply as beautifying the world, but beautifying the world actually means bringing people together in different ways. And how removed this is often as an approach, which I argue is actually the norm in the Islamic tradition, but how removed it feels today in today's political climate. What I offered as, in this kind of climate of the 5 media pillars of Islam, I spoke about 9/11, the frame of 9/11, the frame of violence and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and jihad, and as I argue, jihad and madrasa and Taliban, and these are all English words, right? Not positive ones. And so, although Taliban is a positive words, students, but it's used in a political and negative way. So violence as a second frame, the focus on Muslim women and their oppression, so-called the frame of Islam and the West rather than Islam in the West. As we know, Muslims were in the US right from its start. They were enslaved here in the Americas. Up to 20% of the African slaves were Muslim. Arguably more. Sylviane Diouf and others have done this research. And then the last frame being the frame of the Middle East alone. So we imagine the Muslim world just through this frame of the Middle East, forgetting often that Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country, that South Asia is the largest region of the world where Muslims are, if we take India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, this region. So I just leave you with that sense of how we can use the arts, architecture, and aesthetics as not only a way of countering the political and the negative, which is there, but that these are often there simultaneously, and that we have to contend with whether our focus is going to be on cultural destruction and all of that we're seeing, or our focus is going to be on the part that's the beautiful part, right? And it depends on how we ourselves are located. And I think that goes for any tradition. We can, any tradition other than our own even, we can approach it with negativity. We can approach it with, our scriptures, we often do that, or we can approach it with beauty. So a lot of it is, what we get out of another tradition is also what we project onto it. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Myself, okay. So the reason I'm doing this is in the interest of time. This has been already videotaped and it will avoid my running over. So for the probably one of you who doesn't know me, I'm Rita, and I'm very glad to follow Dr. Munir Jiva because the aesthetic dimension of our spiritual tradition is an incredible resource for sustainability. Not only the sustaining of the human person, but the sustaining of the natural order. And that aesthetic dimension is not well understood. What it does to the human psyche and the transformative effect of that aesthetic dimension on our actions in the world is not well understood, and especially in terms of its relationship to our ecological consciousness. So in the Hindu world, you have a large body of narrative theology, which to my great irritation is called mythology. narrative theology is theology embedded in narrative. You have to work harder to pull out the theology from the narrative. And that harder work involves an immersion and embeddedness in that narrative until it reveals itself to you. And part of that process of what we call Shabda Praman, which is translated as scripture, but literally means the evidence born in Shabda or sound, is a very interesting process. So you have narrative, you have immersion, you have imagination, transformation. And the bridge through this entire process is aesthetics. So this narrative theology, the hermeneutics of it, is not just textual. It is also performative, and not just in terms of recitation, but in terms of dance, in terms of music, in terms of liturgy, in terms of ritual, in terms of pilgrimage, and in terms of art and visual art. And so all of these forms of hermeneutics are embodied hermeneutics. And the bridge between the narrative and the transformed social and environmental action is that aesthetic embodied narrative. I will stop there and I will just put myself on and go to sleep.
Center for Dharma Studies, through which the GTU provides the Masters in Yoga Studies, Masters in Hindu Studies, and 4 concentrations in Hindu Studies, as well as courses in Jain Studies and Indian Buddhist Studies. We are delighted to be able to engage you in this way. It is the ecumenical history of the PSR that gives us the inspiration to move further forward into interreligious collaboration and cooperation. GTU's new master's and doctoral effort towards integrating the religions, the major religions represented on campus, and other traditions that are represented by our students is moving well, and this is an example of our effort to move deeper and further into the direction where we are one ecumenical and interreligious community. The link between sacred texts and action, active action in the world engagement in a benevolent way, is not a straight line, but it takes in all of the elements of being human. We come back to the sacred text and we look at the sacred text and see what is the path of inspiration from the text to action. So I want to talk about a little bit about a particular sacred text, a very, very important sacred text in the Hindu world, known as the Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam is actually the Bhagavata Purana. Puranas are a type of sacred text that I would say represents narrative theology in the Hindu world. It contains cosmogony, cosmology, genealogy of individuals, of kings, of legendary figures, of divine beings, and it contains all manner of cultural elements, as well as every category of systematic theology. So the Bhagavata Purana is focused on the life of Sri Krishna. Krishna is very important in the entire Hindu context because he is the one who reveals the Bhagavad Gita. There are literally thousands of sacred texts in the Hindu world. But if you ask any Hindu about the Bhagavad Gita, the chances are that may well have heard of it, if not read it, unless they were living under a rock for the entire life. So the Bhagavad Gita is a seminal sacred text in the Hindu world. The revealer is Krishna. The revelation is the love of God for humanity. And that it is that relationship of love that takes us back to the divine and that brings the divine to us. The text is believed to have been written at least 200 BCE, the 2nd century before the Common Era, is the latest dating of that text. But the Bhagavata Purana, which tells the story of Krishna's early life, remained in legendary form in oral history for a long time and was finally composed somewhere between the 6th and 10th centuries. This is the understanding of Western scholars. Hindu scholars, of course, and Hindus as a whole will say that the Bhagavad Purana's written composition is neither here nor there, because the story of the divine incarnation, human and divine, surpasses any written text. But the text is a beautiful text, and the narratives are compelling, and they're very emotive, and have led to a vast variety of aesthetic expressions, including several forms of Hindu classical dance, like Odissi and Kathakali and so forth. And even more importantly for our purposes, it has led to a plethora of art depicting Krishna's idyllic life as a child and adolescent in the pastoral fields and forests of Vrindavan in North India. The Yamuna River, which is still there, flowing in India, circumnavigated this area, so it plays an important role. In the narratives, even the vines that grew on the forest floor are an important part of the story. And the theology that is revealed through this story is revealed not only in the presence of wilderness and nature and animals and plant life, but uses all of sentience to tell the story. So we begin with his early life, and then we move on towards his later life. And this part, the part that is embedded in this paradisical, idyllic, pastoral place, has a profound impact on Hindu life and engagement even today. The exhibit that we see on this wall is a group of miniatures that was gifted to the Center for Karma Studies at the GTU by a gentleman in Texas. The paintings are by a very famous artist by the name of B.G. Sharma, and they represent a classical medieval style of painting, but modernized slightly with more affect in the faces. But what's interesting about these paintings is that they talk about and exemplify the narratives that the Bhagavata Purana is famous for. And the narratives begin with Krishna's babyhood and continue through his childhood as a cowherder and his closeness and affection and compassion for the animals, and his friendship with the other cowherds, and his encounter with Radha, who becomes the divine consort. And all of this, several of these paintings take place, have as their locus the Vrindavan's pastoral or arboreal community. Much of that much of this art that is Krishna art, that is embedded in the world of Vrindavan, has been influential in the affect that it produces in those that seek to replicate the concept of Vrindavan in today's world. This painting is particularly important. As I mentioned, Krishna grows up a cowherder, and this painting represents his compassion for sentient beings. He's protecting the calves who are frightened by the thunderstorm. There's several elements present in this painting. First, that the cows have been decorated by the young cowherders who are all covering themselves up from the rain. They're his friends, but he's the one protecting each of those calves, and the cows are looking towards him for their love and compassion. This aspect of Krishna's love for sentient beings and the importance of protecting sentient beings who give us so much. In the case of cows, we depend on them, and yet we don't have cruelty-free dairy in this country. And cruelty-free dairy is one of the things that has been evoked by this art and the narrative that gave rise to it. This painting is emblematic of the theology of Krishna Bhakti. Bhakti is devotional love for the Supreme Divine. Bhakti involves psychology of emotions that one has to negotiate in order to traverse the path to get to the heart of the divine who is waiting for us. And in this painting, the soul of Bhakti is represented, because if you look at the cowherdesses, the gopis in the painting, these are the young girls who grew up with Krishna when he was a child. They were children together, they were friends together, they were adolescents together. And in this painting, what is shown as Sri Krishna is available equally to each of them. And the theological paradigm that this presents is that each of the gopis here is shown as wearing different clothing. If you look closely, not one is wearing the identical clothing, but Krishna is wearing the identical clothing throughout, and he is replicated throughout the painting. In other words, God never changes, but God revels in our uniqueness and in the diversity of our distinctive actualization of his divine potential. In the center is Radha Krishna dancing. In the Hindu world, God is not a trinity, but a bi-unity, and integrates and surpasses the masculine and feminine, and everything they represent in terms of gendered norms. It integrates and bypasses it in bi-unity, but the feminine is associated with immanence, immanental love. And therefore, Radha, who is Krishna's consort in this divine play, is both the source and the path to redemption through bhakti, because she is emblematic of love. This painting is a very important painting and emblematic of the relationship of the divine couple to human souls. And again, as you can see, it's set in this deeply arboreal context, surrounded by various sentient beings. The idea is that the planetary family, creation itself, is in love with the divine, and the divine is in love with its own creation. This concept of Vrindavan, where this revelation took place, has fired the Hindu imagination and given rise to transformative aesthetics. So the transformative aesthetics has produced a lineage of art and benevolent action in the world. This tradition of Krishna Bhakti, for example, has created over 40 eco-villages globally. And the eco-villages have sustainable agriculture and cruelty-free dairy, protection for its animals, and the animals are allowed to live out their entire lives even after they are no longer able to produce milk or pull a cart, as the case may be. These eco-villages that have been produced by the adherents of Krishna Bhakti are efforts to recreate the Vrindavan in which revelation took place. And these are called new Vrindavans. And so there are recreations of the temples that are in Vrindavan from medieval times. There's a recreation of the Yamuna River, of the forested foliage of Vrindavan, and of course of the animals which are loved and protected as in Vrindavan. This December I visited one of these communities. It's known as Govardhan Eco-Village. Again, the term Govardhan is the mountain. It's taken from the context of these narrative tales. And this eco-village has water harvesting, sewage treatment plants which grow flowers and horticulture and sustainable agriculture, animal protection, and cruelty-free dairy. The eco-village has garnered any number of international awards, and 1 week after I left, it garnered the award from the United Nations World Tourism Organization for the UN Innovative and Sustainable Ecotourism. So the line from the Bhagavatam, the Srimad Bhagavatam, and its beautiful narratives to art, to transformational awareness, and to benevolent action and engagement has proven to be a very fertile ground for us to reflect on how our sacred text can inspire our imagination, our emotion, and our transformation.
Have you planned a trip for us? I'm just going to leave you with that idea that art can lead to transformative, sustainable action. And the many ways it can do that.
Hi, everybody. Okay, Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, 1872 to 1950, are his dates, was the founder of a yoga community in South India based in a system he named Integral Yoga. The idea of integrality as he taught it related to the fragmented ontology of individual existence. Based on the Upanishads, human psychology is internally fragmented, and the integration of this was the primary consideration in integral yoga. However, since the boundaries of the personality in the Upanishads extend to cosmic and transcendental dimensions, the scope of the integral yoga included such an expansion and union of consciousness. There were several ways in which Sri Aurobindo's teachings differed from that of traditional yoga schools. Apart from a life-affirming psychological orientation, Sri Aurobindo had been one of the pioneers of India's anti-colonial struggle for independence. So this is a scene from one of the nationalist meetings, the Surat Congress from 1907. And his thinking sprang from and included a political dimension that engaged with the Western epistemic roots of colonization. He envisaged a future which replicated under new conditions networks of autonomous city-states, such as in ancient Greece or India. He felt a rich collective life could develop in such habitats based on direct participatory self-government as the external space supporting the internal experiment of integral yoga. The yoga community in Pondicherry that grew up around him and his spiritual partner, Mira Alfasa, also known as the mother. So that's the mother. Could be thought of as a beginning for the implementation of these ideas. The ashram served as a space resistant to the global drive of capital and offered a buffer for selective assimilation of modernity. This is a modern component. I don't go into it because there's not enough time, but this relates to other thinkers, national thinkers, like Tagore and Gandhi, who were also going back to the ashram model to, in a sense, create a space for selective assimilation of modernity. A factor predisposing respect for environment in the teachings of integral yoga was the affirmation of divinity at all levels of existence. So Brahman is everywhere, including the material. This led to care for all material things as relations of consciousness, a practice of relational monism. Everything has got everything. So it's all is one, but we can get into relation and through that exchange consciousness. Sri Aurobindo passed away in 1950. So that's his last one. Shortly after the end of World War II and Indian independence. So he did not live to see the enhanced phase of technology that has increasingly hegemonized the world since the mid-1960s, making industrialism, consumerism, and ecological dysfunction the ontology of our times. This is the state even in 1970. However, his spiritual partner, the mother, lived on till 1973, and in 1968 decided to found a new international community in proximity to Pondicherry so as to manifest more of the social and political goals of Sri Aurobindo, addressing the increasing globalization of the world and the effects of global capital. So this is the founding of that community called Auroville. Auroville is the name she gave this community, providing a charter for it which emphasized its international scope and its integrated foundation. She wrote it in French. I'm not going to read it for lack of time, but you can kind of see the sense of it. It was inclusive of psychological and cultural dimensions. Implicitly, by her choice of a tract of barren land on the Coromandel coast, she also ensured that this effort at integration would include the natural environment. To own the psychological and cultural community and the environment as one's larger self, and to experience this in relation and identity of consciousness became a central aspect of this implementation of the integral yoga, and she called it a collective yoga. That's how she described it. The mother also saw this effort as symbolic, a model town that could be replicated as the unit for distributed sustainable communities of the future. To speak adequately of the interrelated organization of Auroville as a collective life, one must touch on a variety of innovations, such as the idea of a city with a soul. And that's the soul of Auroville. She gave it the name Matri Mandir. This idea of a city with a soul is also something that emerges around the first 2 decades of the 20th century in Europe. And people start rethinking habitats. And so this is an idea of something sacred, which is impersonal in the sense that it does not belong to any individual, but the whole city embodies it. And it sort of replicates the notion of the mosque or of the temple, which becomes the center of a city in medieval or pre-modern times. So innovations such as the idea of a city with a soul, moneyless economy, consensus democracy, aiming at what Sri Aurobindo called spiritual anarchy, free progress, education, galaxy zoning, cottage industries, and cultural relations. These features fall out of scope of this paper. Here, I can only introduce the aspect of the community's relationship with the natural environment, which includes earth, water, bioregion, energy resources, architecture as it relates to environment, and relations with indigenous communities within and around its content. As with many regions worldwide, the land area of Auroville had once been forested. Indiscriminate grazing and timbering caused the forest to disappear, and heavy monsoon storms laid the land bare and leached the topsoil into the ocean. This is a universal story. In the late 60s and early 70s, the early inhabitants of Auroville, and here you can see sort of the landscape in the early 1970s, for example, made reforestation one of their major priorities as a foundation for soil building, biodiversity, water catchment, agriculture, and habitable shade. This effort had to be made in tandem with water conservation, building bunds, check dams, canals, and catchment tanks to prevent rainwater fall-off, not runoff. The Australian Acacia auriculoformis, this is the tree. Was found to be a quick-growing tree which held the soil, created biomass and humus, and provided shade so that other indigenous species could grow below it. It's kind of ironic that a foreign tree had to be the holding agent for the indigenous forest to return. Tamil Nadu has a culture of sacred groves, and land workers collected seeds from these regions to plant the soil. So these are local areas that are left for the goddess to inhabit. They're wild areas, sort of native wildness. So these were reserves of, sort of the seed culture, the indigenous seed culture. Aurovillians also sought out indigenous experts who knew about local plants, as well as scientists to guide them in the kind of forest suitable to the area, which has been categorized as tropical dry evergreen forest, shortened as TDEF. These efforts created a forest around the living area of Auroville known as the Green Belt. And so this is how it looks now.
Wow.
That's the Green Belt. At present, Auroville is largely reforested and houses a population of about 2,500 inhabitants, distributed in smaller residential and work communities. So they're all over. You can hardly see them. You can see little patches here, here, here. So they're all inside this forested area. A detailed analysis of the regional medical flora was compiled, and this has revitalized local health traditions. A number of independent green sanctuary projects continue, so this has diversified into individual efforts. One of the more this Pichandi forest is one of the largest ones. It's also a bioresource. So you can walk through the forest and you get these educational kind of drawings. These educational drawings, and if any of you travel along the Eastern Coast Road in Tamil Nadu, you'll see these toll posts with these paintings of plants, wildlife, etc. They're all made here. These people have a kind of a painting studio where they produce these and then put them all over the roadways. So these have become educational resources for medicinal properties and other forest users for the community as well as the larger region. Reforestation consultancy is provided and projects undertaken from Oroville for several bioregions, including some of it is even going abroad. Production and harvest of wood brings an income for the community. Carpentry, kindling, and wood products are managed so that the forests are not endangered. In August 2000, the Oroville Botanical Garden was established. Which conserves, multiplies, and disseminates seeds. Today, Oroville seeds and grains are traded throughout the world. A forestry group has been formed which coordinates activities between these projects. The foundational principle in agricultural production was food security in order to secure a future for the region. So this brings back the soil, and that allows agriculture to occur. Improvement of the soil has aided agriculture and food production so as to move towards self-sufficiency. This is one of the more prominent farms. It's called Solitude Farm. And people go there and donate their time and work on the land. Improvement of the soil has aided. No chemicals are used in farming practices, and farm production has been effective and financially viable. Several farms of varied sizes and methods now exist, which send their produce to the Central Oroville Food Division. In 1984, to address the water and energy needs, Oroville started the Center for Scientific Research, CSR. Water conservation efforts through rainwater harvesting have been supplemented by bore wells. CSR conducts hydrogeological studies for mapping the coastal watershed and aquifers. It undertakes the implementation of decentralized wastewater recycling systems for Oroville communities. So you see that these wastewater systems are all over, and this introduces an aesthetic dimension, which is the water is not just used for utilitarian purposes, but it actually creates the sense of sacredness of land by giving it that aesthetic uplift. Water recycling systems for Oroville communities and provides consulting and turnkey services for household to industrial level units outside. At present, several Oroville homes, residential communities, schools, cottage industries, and cultural centers recycle their water, which is used in a variety of ways, from domestic and garden irrigation use to integration of water bodies such as pools, channels, and fountains in buildings. So this is an example of that. Alternative energy projects researched and implemented by CSR include biogas, wind pumps and generators, and thermal electric solar devices. These products and services are also marketed. Among the most useful large-scale projects in this area is the 8-meter solar parabolic concentrator, which generates the heat for steam cooking 2 meals a day for 1,000 people in the largest of Oroville's community kitchens, eponymously called the Solar Kitchen. So this is the Solar Kitchen. You can see the board there. It's a thermal concentrator. It converts the sun's energy into heat. So they have both solar, thermosolar, as they call it, turning it into heat and turning it into electricity. They're two different uses. CSR is also involved in research pertaining to innovative low-cost building materials such as reinforced rand earth and ferrocement. It partners with architects and designers to implement climatically conscious structures that harmonize with natural elements to maximize sustainable living conditions. So Oroville has become a real haven for architects, and really advanced architecture is produced there. This architect, Anupama Kundu, this is one of her structures in Oroville. She actually was featured in the Venice Biennale a few years back, and one of her entire structures was reconstructed there. Many of these environmental efforts are undertaken with the help of Tamil villagers from local villages. So you see that that's one other dimension of this is the interaction with the indigenous communities. Within or neighboring the Auroville region, the relationship between Aurovillians and Tamil villagers works both ways in these cases. Often the villagers provide expert knowledge of the region and indigenous methods, while foreign educated Aurovillians bring scientific and technical knowledge to make effective the environmentally sustainable projects for the benefit of all in the region. Villagers are most often paid workers for whom these projects can be means of sustenance. There's also the idea of forest products which the villagers can use for free. Though sometimes exposure to such projects have made some individuals take leadership roles and become Aurovillians. So a lot of villagers become Aurovillians. Environmental projects have thus helped to build practical and affective relations between Aurovillians of various ethnicities and nationalities and locals, though tensions also continue and cannot be overlooked. This shows you picking firewood, villagers getting firewood from the forests. In conclusion, Auroville provides a contemporary example of a culturally plural community working with local rural inhabitants to develop sustainable habitats based on a spiritual ideal of relational monism. In doing this, scientific and technological knowledges are not eschewed, but delinked from corporate capital-driven agendas and mixed with indigenous knowledges to benefit harmonious integral lifestyles.
First of all, I just wanted to say that I feel honored to be welcomed onto this panel. First year doctoral student on faculty. And I want to express my gratitude for that honor and hope that I do justice to it in my presentation. When I started at the GTU, I had a desire to work on developing a dynamic doctrine of creation, specifically hearing this call from within the pages of Jürgen Moltmann's God and Creation. However, contrary to Moltmann, I had a desire to situate this ecologically grounded concept of God in a way that honors theology as practiced within Western tradition overall. As Augustine is foundational for Catholic thought, was the interlocutor toward whom Luther turned for the seeds of the Reformation, and is a fundamental for a great deal of Anglican and Episcopalian theology. His doctrine of creation is the one with which I chose to work, given that it can serve as a common ground in these branches of the vine that is the Western tradition. This could be seen as problematic, for Augustine is frequently cited as the source of spiritual disconnect with nature, e.g. Colin Gunton, Thomas Marsh, Sally McFadden, Leonardo Boff, and Anne Primavesi, to name but a few. While their critiques are understandable in the light of how Augustine's thought is typically construed, I contend with Scott Dunham's assertion from the Trinity in creation in Augustine that if we focus on Augustine's doctrine of creation, as well as his magnum opus on the Trinity, we will find an understanding of his thought which is much more amenable to ecologically conscious living. There are essentially two forms of critique which are leveled against Augustine's thought in terms of its stance toward creation. Either he is assessed to be structurally patriarchal and hierarchical, this distinction between use and enjoyment being understood to give leave to treat instrumentally all creatures outside of humanity. Or he is critiqued on the grounds that, in his attempts to fit Christian doctrine with Neoplatonic concepts such as the One, he values unity over diversity and, consequently, devalues the variety of creatures found in creation. While Augustine used the term paterfamilias in an attempt to balance the humble and merciful of the Christian tradition with the eternal and ineffable of the Greco-Roman philosophers of the empire, he spends the first 4 books of the Trinity stressing the co-equality of the persons in the Godhead. This relationship of co-equality is constituted by love, with the Father and the Son cleaving to one another through the dynamic glue that is the love of the Holy Spirit. As the Son and the Spirit are at constant work in creation and its continuing governance, the Father cleaves to creation as he cleaves to his Son. In this way, the Imago Dei serves as a limiting concept for us, and the dominion that God grants us is meant to be a will guided by love toward the ultimate good, with the best interests of the entirety of creation in mind. This runs counter to interpretation that would read the term use as license to unleash an arbitrary will or the libido dominandi, both of which form the core of human nature as distorted by original sin. In regard to the critique that Augustine stresses unity over Trinity, diversity, and relation in order to appeal to the Neoplatonic philosophy of the Roman Empire, this line of thought depicts Augustine as favoring the Platonic understanding of the One, thus making the Trinity of persons subordinate to their unity of substance, and further sees the interpretation of Genesis 1 as subversive to the valuation of diversity in creation. However, Augustine typically starts his assessments of the Trinity through the economic activity of its members, and from there moves to the unity of God. This is made evident in his doctrine that the mission of the Son and the Holy Spirit in creation is to impart saving knowledge of God. As for devaluing creatures within creation, Augustine claims in the literal meaning of Genesis that all creatures are good individually, and in their sum are very good, in congruence with God's proclamation in the book of Genesis. From this revaluation of Augustine's doctrine of creation, we can see that our role in being made in the image of God and having been given dominion is to help in the continual flourishing of creation and its continued governance by the Son and Holy Spirit. To help us understand how we could see ourselves as practicing a dominion of right relation, we can look to the economic activity of the Trinity for guidance. The Father, in creating, has given the overall structure for harmonious living. The Son, as the Word, provides the ideal form for each creature as it fits within that structure. And finally, the Holy Spirit, in loving creatures, works to perfect their form, giving them the dynamic impetus to develop into that form they must take to live in accord with their ecological niche. To discern this ordering of dynamism within creation, Augustine references Wisdom 11:20. You have arranged all things by measure and number and weight. Measure is the part played by the Father in the economic activity of governance, setting the limits within which to understand right relation. Number is that of the Son, that the form that creatures must take to best fit within the limits of this order. Weight is that of the Holy Spirit, guiding creatures to perfection in their form. And having been granted dominion, we must learn to see how best to play our part in this process, letting the Spirit guide us to help discern how best to help the members of creation to flourish within the perfections of their form, within the limitations of the order that is set upon them by the ecosystem in which they live. Given that Christian spirituality is generally anthropocentrically understood, or at its worst, androcentrically, I hope to connect this Trinitarian doctrine of creation with indigenous American spirituality, as this tradition has understood creation in relation to this land in which we live, the colonizers, in which we, the colonizers, have made our homes. Through Randy Woodley's Shalom in the Community of Creation, which connects indigenous American spirituality to Christian thought by way of Jewish thought. While Woodley does a great job synthesizing the land-based spiritualities of various tribes through the work he did for his dissertation, he did a disservice to the Judeo-Christian tradition by homogenizing and simplifying Jewish spirituality a la Breumann and equating Christian spirituality with Enlightenment-era philosophy. Thus, I look to Daniel Boyarin's work in Borderlines, which traces the Logos Christology of the first chapter in John's Gospel back to its roots in Hellenistic Judaism, to elucidate the connection between Augustine's Hellenistic Christian doctrine of creation and its origins in Hellenistic Judaism. While it is typically thought that Logos theology was a Neoplatonic development which fundamentally separated Christians from Palestinian Judaism, Boyarin tells a different story. What occurs in his version is that Christianity and Judaism developed as distinct traditions through mutual differentiation via heresiology. The pith of his argument comes from his reading of John's Gospel, which tends to be construed as the least Jewish of the Gospels, given its heavy use of Neoplatonic concept that seem to mirror imperial imposition. This is the reason that many in Protestant theological circles use rhetoric of the de-Hellenization of the Gospel. However, the first 5 verses of John's Gospel reflect a midrashic reading of Genesis 1 through a gloss of Proverbs 8 that was a frequent occurrence in Hellenistic Judaism at the time. This reading combined the Logos, or Memra, of God from Genesis with the personified wisdom of God in Proverbs 8. Thus, John's Gospel is read as reflecting a two-powers theology that was frequent in Hellenistic Judaism of the day, as reflected in a number of dialogues within the rabbinic texts. What is truly unique about what was to become the Christian movement was its combination of Jewish messianic soteriology with equally Jewish theology in the figure of Jesus, and equally Jewish logos theology, my apologies. Instead of this Neoplatonic core being the basis of differentiation, what truly led to the formation of Christianity as a distinct movement from Judaism was a mutual process of heresiology. Christians defined Judaism in terms of monarchianism, modalism, and Sabellianism, while the two powers in heaven movement became identified with the Christians for rabbinic Judaism, thus making these Christians the heretics in chief. Now that the roots of Augustine's Hellenistic Christianity have been seen in the soil of Hellenistic Judaism from which they arose, it becomes possible to develop a Trinitarian doctrine of creation that can be situated in this context. Augustinian Trinitarianism has been primed for placement in a cosmology based on a shalom-type construct. In a bit of constructive work on the part of Douglas A. Knight that compares Hebrew Bible cosmogony to other Near Eastern religions, 3 concepts are drawn out that mutually inform one another to produce a harmonious state of being: Shalom, Tzedakah, and Mishpat. He says of these, by the way, I apologize in advance if I butchered those terms. I'm just learning how to pronounce it. He says of these, the Tetragrammaton created the world according to Tzedakah, righteousness, a principle of moral and cosmic orderliness. When Tzedakah prevails, the world is at harmony, in a state of well-being, in Shalom. An act of sin in the religious sphere or injustice in the social sphere can inject discord and shatter Shalom. It then takes a decisive act of Mishpat, justice, to restore the Shalom and reestablish the Tzedakah. Only when all deserving persons, here I would say creatures, enjoy the fullness of life in community can Tzedakah reign. It seems possible to align Augustine's measure, number, and weight with these Hebrew Bible cosmological concepts. Mishpat, as the dynamic force of justice, which restores the harmony called the shalom, can be understood to parallel the Holy Spirit as way. Likewise, shalom represents the ideal form of all in creation, and thus can be seen as the number of the sun. And when shalom has been finally and fully restored, we find the measure of the Father in righteousness, or tzedakah. Understood this way, we have a more fully developed picture that does justice to the Judeo-Christian self-understanding, which can now be put into dialogue with the harmony way constructs that Randy Woodley has developed. In his native Cherokee, the concepts of Elahe as well-being and harmony and Duyukta as justice find their parallels in shalom and number, and mishpat and weight, respectively. This places them in dialogue with the harmony way constructs Woodley enumerates. From the Iroquois Tadadaho to the Lakota Mitakuya Oyasin, from the Navajo Hozo to the Kanaka Maoli Pono. From this formulation, we can envision a way to enter into right relations with this land in a manner that is both theologically and spiritually sound. In light of the potential hegemonic forces at play in these metaphysical claims, referencing Richard Newman, I feel I must state that I'm merely looking to lay the groundwork within Christian tradition that can serve as a catalyst for dialogue with these other faith traditions, and I'm not attempting to make metaphysical claims regarding their content. As regards the plethora of indigenous spiritualities, each has a unique form and character. So how these concepts could best align with their spiritual tradition can only come about in dialogue with them, about the ways in which they've learned to live in accord with this land, that is their hallowed home. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panel of speakers. We have about 10 minutes for questions and dialogue, and that's by no means enough time to engage with these very rich presentations. So there is a coffee break coming up at 3. So if you can't ask your question now, there will be an opportunity over caffeine and sweets to engage with the speakers then. Yes.
So this is a question for Dr. Pike. I couldn't help but noticing in the last community that you showed, there was National Geographic and then Time a little later.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what are the attitudes towards civilized forms of communication and media, cell phones and things like that in particular? I guess more broadly speaking, is there a general rejection of civilization, or is it more of what Dr. Banerjee was saying of a selective appropriation of modernity?
Yeah, that was such a wonderful term to think about, because I think it is that. I mean, you have a real range between people that see themselves as more purists, and those are kind of picking and choosing. So the community that I spent the most time with, Wild Roots, they have a landline, they don't have cell phones, they have a landline. They go and use the library in town when they want to update their website. So it's really ironic so many of these communities have websites, right? That's how I found out about them in the first place. Yeah, so it's definitely, and in terms of reading, I mean, they have books, they have a huge library, because during the winter, there's not a whole lot that can be done. So they're mostly inside reading all winter. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a really excellent question. Obviously, most of them are not trying to recreate every aspect of the sort of pre-industrial lifestyle. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
I had a question for Munir Jiwa. First of all, Paul Sherbaugh, right before I left, he said, give my greetings to you, so from Center for World Religions in New York. Actually, if I could just ask a question, General, about this term earthlings. Is that we are earthlings, does that imply a duality between the being of us and the being of the earth in that term itself? I've been thinking a lot about this word ecocentrism. That if we're going to have a robust ecological approach to reality, we have to look at the world and the totality of its being, and not necessarily look at the earth ourselves as part of, fundamentally as part of the earth, and not the center of the earth. But I'm just wondering if if that term implies that we are something fundamentally different than the earth rather than something fundamentally just part of the earth. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question.
Well, no, it's a good observation, and part of our conference a couple of years ago was trying to think through what this actually means, and there were varied perspectives on it from, yes, it somehow unifies us as those inhabiting the earth and our responsibility to each other and all our precarity and vulnerability and kind of shared sense of, and then a shared sense of kind of planet of earth, and then there's a sense of how does our sense of being earthlings relate to other planets, beings, the larger universe, and I think both aspects are there. I was trying to use it in a more restricted sense, of course, because I said as when I think of the ET stuff, it's mind-boggling because it demands so many more moral and ethical questions that I have not really committed myself to yet. But I was using it in a more restricted term of how earthlings enlarges our otherwise particular identities and locations. So, you know, if I identify as Muslim, but, you know, from Kenya, Indian origin, Canadian, student, professor, all these identities make different demands on us in our social relations, but then earthlings does something else as well. So that's the way I was trying to use it. And what would that mean? What would it mean to imagine ourselves as kind of sharing a planet?
Well, I'll ask a question. Sort of using the last presentation from Gordon as a frame, I'm very struck by the global dimensions, the different, very specific contextual locations the presentations have given us. And I'm wondering if you could comment generally on some of the points of continuity, given the very different and divergent theological locations for the rewilding community, Auroville, gardens in Zanzibar, Gardovan, and other eco-villages. What are some practices in relationship to the natural world that might have points of continuity?
So my question was actually bring up a reflection on exactly that. And it's almost scary. The
She
thing
didn't give me that in advance.
Something else going on.
Pass it to me. So, you know, what's interesting is, the question that comes to mind is, what are the influences in the surrounding communities? You know, what are the influences in the surrounding communities that we were dealing with, the particular Harmony Way? Do they affect other Native American communities? I mean, is there a network, you know, in terms of Khan's massive monumental efforts across the world? Of course, we know it affects communities that are surrounding. And Auroville, as you said, has an impact on its surroundings. And Govarda and Eco-Village, also it's in northern Maharashtra. And one of the things they do is that they teach other villages, many of them are indigenous tribal villages, and how to essentially get to that sustainability. That is existential sustainability and of course also environmental sustainability. I mean, this village has, you know, like Auroville, but on a smaller scale, everything from sewage treatment to water harvesting to plastic recycling to biofuels, you know, organic agriculture, as well as, you know, traditional plant-based medicine and so on. All of these knowledge systems, both, you know, technical and non-technical. The place is run by monks who are all IT professionals and engineers. and then they go and, you know, they proliferate this knowledge among the villages. So, you know, my sense is that when you have these things going on, and this is a question, not a statement, the impact on the surrounding communities is something we have to consider. Is it, you know, is it impactful?
Are they doing, I mean, I was thinking about the educational, kind of what you were talking about. Is there some fluidity of movement in, from the community and out again to take the word out? But you know, what I'm really struck by in all of them is the uses of history and the desire to restore some kind of past, whether it's the past, the stories of Krishna, or, I mean, that seemed one thing that really linked a lot of our cases.
Well, you know, they talk about mythic time all the time, and I find that a little bit disturbing. I don't want to find myself in a myth. There's also the concept of a transcendent time, meaning not time that is transcendent, but transcending time. So that when you are immersed in these narratives or in sacred texts, whatever the tradition, or sacred narratives, the point of that theological experience is that that immersion actually allows us to transcend space-time.
To be in the past, really. Or it's not even to think of it as a past.
Neither past nor
Yeah.
present nor
Right.
future is to transcend time,
Right.
in that moment.
Yeah, but I think that's very important, interesting idea that in a sense that I think you use some great terms as well, you know, to think about narratives, that actually narrative theology is what you call it. So you actually performatively live the theology and the narrative is in the performance. And you experience the time, which is actually a transcendent time. But I think the other thing about time, past, history, and the future, also the notion of the earthling that you were talking about, is that in a way we are, you know, creatures of modernity. And there's no really escape, there's no escape from that. And modernity is an ontology of rupture. There is somewhere inside us the sense that we've left the past. There's the notion of the past and the catapulting into the unknown. And so, in a sense, in all this, there's the recovery of the past, but in some sense, there is the need to be universal, the need to go out of, you know, grounded traditions into something which is beyond it. And I think it's the negotiation between the two.
Selective recovery of the past.
Yeah. That's going on in all these cases. It's a negotiated reality.
Can you save your question for the?
Oh, no, it's all right. It's just a comment
Okay.
that Aurobindo was looking to the future. And these two examples from the Gita and the Islamic reconstruction is building directly on the past. But Aurobindo was visionary like Teilhard de Chardin, scientific.
Yeah,
So
I
I
think
think
there
there's a
too, we
difference.
have that there is a difference, and yet there is the same thing of kind of trying to take the past and deal with the present and the future.
I think there's an element of continuity that doesn't have to be a positive or negative. It's not a value judgment term, but a certain kind of continuity and how we think about continuity with multiple temporalities together. You know, whether it's an intentional community that sees itself recovering a time, but it presents a different way in which to think about time and space.
Yes.
Right, but I think one of the things that we found to Devin's question is there's a sense that different possibilities of communities come together in this, right? So there's a sense of that. I think what's also shared is a sense of people thinking beyond, a certain kind of self-cultivation, but doing that in community, so it's a kind of building of community. And I think it's a commitment to a certain kind of ethical living, however we define it. So there's, I think, elements of that that you see, and they manifest themselves in very different ways.
Yeah.
But that seems to be a thread that we,
I would agree.
yeah.
Well, I don't want your future to become the past.